On July 2nd, 1457, in the mountains of Albania, 8,000 Christian warriors prepared to face 40,000 of the Ottoman Empire's finest soldiers in what would become the most brutal family feud in medieval history. The morning mist clung to the Albulina valley like a funeral shroud, but by sunset, that mist would be stained crimson with the blood of brothers. Think about those numbers for a moment. 8,000 against 40,000. That's a 5-to-1 disadvantage in the heart of Europe, where the fate of Christian civilization hung by a thread thinner than spider's silk. Standing atop the rocky crags overlooking the valley, a man prepared to commit what every military manual would call suicide. György Castrioti, known to history as Skanderbeg, gazed down at an Ottoman army that stretched across the plain like a black sea of steel and silk. These weren't raiders or bandits. This was the military machine that had shattered Constantinople just 4 years earlier, led by his own nephew, Hamza Castrioti, who had abandoned the Christian faith for Ottoman gold and glory. The sight of those familiar banners flying over enemy ranks must have felt like watching his own son march to destroy him. Picture this impossible scene. 40,000 Ottoman warriors spreading across 3 miles of Albanian countryside, their armor glinting in the morning sun, their war cries echoing off the mountain walls in a dozen languages. Janissaries who had never known defeat. Sipahi cavalry, whose lances had pierced the hearts of Byzantine emperors. Engineers whose cannons had reduced the walls of empires to rubble. Against them stood 8,000 Albanian mountain fighters, many armed with weapons their grandfathers had carried, defending valleys their ancestors had bled to protect. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. This wasn't David facing Goliath. This was David hunting Goliath, and Goliath had just walked into a trap 14 years in the making. Skanderbeg wasn't some desperate mountain chieftain making a last stand. He was a former Ottoman general who had spent his youth learning their tactics, studying their weaknesses, and planning for exactly this moment. When he escaped Ottoman captivity in 1443 and reconverted to Christianity, he brought with him something more valuable than any treasure. He brought their secrets. The mathematical impossibility staggers even now. The Ottoman force included 12,000 Janissaries, the elite infantry corps trained from childhood to know no fear, no mercy, no retreat. Supporting them were 20,000 Sipahi cavalry, mounted warriors whose ancestors had carved an empire stretching from the Danube to the Nile. 8,000 assorted infantry and engineers completed a force that had conquered more territory in 50 years than Rome managed in 2 centuries. They carried cannons that could shatter castle walls, composite bows that could kill at 300 yards, and curved sabers that had tasted the blood of a dozen nations. Facing this juggernaut, Skanderbeg commanded 8,000 Albanians, whose greatest advantage was knowing every rock, every stream, every hidden path in these unforgiving mountains. They fought with medieval weapons against gunpowder technology, with courage against overwhelming numbers, with faith against an empire that seemed divinely blessed with victory. The smart money said the Albanian resistance would end before noon. Ships waited in Venetian ports to evacuate the survivors. European courts had already begun composing elegies for the last Christian stronghold in the Balkans. But as the morning sun climbed higher over the Albanian peaks, something unprecedented was stirring in the mountain camps above Albulina. Skanderbeg wasn't planning to defend. He was planning to hunt, and his prey had just entered the killing ground. For 14 years, these Albanian mountains had witnessed the impossible become routine. Since 1443, when Skanderbeg first raised the double-headed eagle banner of his ancestors, Albanian forces had shattered Ottoman armies that outnumbered them 3, 4, even 6-to-1. The Sultan's war councils had grown weary of explaining how Albanian shepherds could defeat the military machine that had conquered 2 continents. But this time was different. This time, Mehmed II had sent not just an army, but a message written in the blood of Skanderbeg's own family. Hamza Castrioti had been raised as a Christian, baptized in the same mountain churches where his uncle now prayed for victory. But at 15, like his uncle before him, he had been taken as tribute to the Ottoman court, converted to Islam, and moulded into an instrument of the empire's will. The difference was devastating. Where Skanderbeg had escaped and returned to his faith, Hamza had embraced his captor's cause with the fervour of a true believer. Now 25, he commanded respect in Ottoman circles that his uncle's rebellion had earned him only hatred. This wasn't just another military campaign. This was fratricide, sanctified by competing gods. The psychological warfare had begun months before the first soldier crossed the Albanian border. Hamza's letters to his uncle, dictated in perfect Turkish but written in Albanian script, had been crafted to wound deeper than any blade. One message, delivered by a captured Albanian scout, read simply, "Uncle, your mountains cannot hide you from family forever. Your nephew remembers every story you told of these valleys. Now, I bring 40,000 friends to share them." The personal had become political, faith had become weapon, and family loyalty had transformed into the cruelest battlefield advantage imaginable. Here's what makes this confrontation truly terrifying. Skanderbeg's previous victories had relied on Ottoman commanders who didn't understand Albanian terrain, who underestimated mountain warfare, who treated this rebellion as a minor frontier irritation. Hamza possessed none of these. Weaknesses. He had spent childhood summers in these same valleys, learning their secrets from the man he now hunted. When Ottoman scouts reported Albanian defensive positions, Hamza could predict not just where they would retreat, but which hidden paths they would use, which caves could shelter their wounded, which springs provided water for besieged forces. The intelligence reports reaching Skanderbeg's mountain headquarters painted a picture of systematic encirclement. Ottoman advance units weren't simply marching toward Albanian strongholds. They were positioning themselves along escape routes that only someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain could identify. Ancient smuggling paths that Skanderbeg had used to outflank previous Ottoman armies were now guarded by Janissary companies. Mountain springs that had sustained Albanian resistance for over a decade were controlled by enemy cavalry. Hamza was fighting this war with his uncle's own playbook, perfected by Ottoman discipline and funded by the empire's endless resources. But Skanderbeg possessed one advantage that 14 years of warfare had burned into his very soul. Every Ottoman victory, every Christian defeat, every village burned and monastery desecrated had taught him that survival meant abandoning conventional military wisdom. Where normal commanders saw impossible odds, he had learned to recognize opportunity disguised as disaster. As July heat baked the Albanian peaks and his nephew's vast army spread across the valley floor like a conquering plague, the old mountain fighter was already calculating trajectories of desperation that would either destroy his forces completely or achieve something so impossible that future generations would call it divine intervention. The Albulina plain stretched below like a natural amphitheater designed by God for slaughter. 3 miles long and 2 miles wide, the valley floor offered perfect cavalry terrain, grassland so ideal for mounted warfare that Ottoman military manuals could have used it as a textbook illustration. But those same manuals never mentioned what Skanderbeg saw from his mountain perch, 3 narrow passes that served as the valley's only exits, each barely wide enough for 50 horsemen riding abreast. What appeared to be perfect ground for deploying 40,000 warriors was actually the world's largest trap, if someone possessed both the tactical genius and suicidal courage to spring it. Picture this impossible chess game unfolding in the pre-dawn darkness of July 2nd. Hamza's forces had positioned themselves exactly where military doctrine demanded, center formations occupying the valley floor, flanks secured against the mountain walls, supply trains protected in the rear. Every principle of Ottoman battlefield organization had been followed with textbook precision, but Skanderbeg had spent 14 years studying how to turn Ottoman strengths into fatal weaknesses. Those disciplined formations that made his nephew's army invincible on open ground would become death traps if their retreat routes disappeared. Those heavy cavalry units that could shatter any frontal assault would become liability if forced to fight dismounted on broken terrain. Here's where legend meets reality. Albanian war councils had always operated under one brutal assumption. They possessed neither the numbers nor equipment to defeat Ottoman armies in conventional battle. Victory required creating conditions so fundamentally different from normal warfare that Ottoman tactical advantages became meaningless. Skanderbeg's plan for Albulina violated every principle of military science, while simultaneously exploiting every geographic advantage these mountains offered. Instead of defending strongholds that could be besieged, he would attack. Instead of preserving his limited forces through defensive warfare, he would commit everything to a single assault that would either destroy the Ottoman army completely or eliminate Albanian resistance forever. The psychological dimension defied comprehension. Skanderbeg was asking 8,000 mountain fighters to charge downhill toward an enemy that outnumbered them 5-1, on terrain that favored heavy cavalry, against formations that included the most disciplined infantry in the world. Albanian commanders, who had followed him through 14 years of impossible victories, now questioned whether their leader had finally succumbed to suicidal madness. The mathematics were unavoidable. Even if every Albanian killed 5 Ottomans before dying, they would still lose. Even if divine intervention blessed their weapons with supernatural effectiveness, the numbers remained impossible. But Skanderbeg understood something about warfare that Ottoman military academies had never taught. Battles aren't won by counting soldiers. They're won by controlling where those soldiers can move, how they can fight, and most importantly, where they can run when everything goes wrong. The Albulina Valley wasn't just terrain. It was a weapon, and he was about to demonstrate how 8,000 men, who knew every rock, every slope, every hidden approach, could turn geographic knowledge into tactical supremacy. As first light began creeping across the eastern peaks, Skanderbeg gave the order that would either vindicate 14 years of rebellion or end Albanian resistance forever. His forces began their descent toward the valley floor, moving through mountain paths so narrow that discovery meant certain death, carrying weapons that seemed primitive compared to Ottoman technology, sustained by nothing except faith that impossible odds were just another word for opportunity. Dawn broke at 5:47 a.m. with deceptive tranquility across the Albulina Valley. Ottoman sentries, posted at regulation intervals around their massive camp, reported nothing unusual to their commanders, still breaking fast in silk pavilions. The morning routine proceeded exactly as it had for 3 days, horses watered, weapons inspected, formations prepared for what everyone assumed would be another day of methodical advance toward Albanian strongholds. But high on the eastern slopes, 8,000 shadows were already moving through pre-dawn darkness, descending paths so treacherous that a single misplaced step meant death on rocks 300 feet below. At 6:15 a.m., the first Ottoman patrol encountered what appeared to be a standard Albanian raiding party, perhaps 50 men emerging from a ravine on the valley's northern edge. Standard procedure demanded immediate pursuit to prevent intelligence gathering, and 2 companies of Sipahi cavalry thundered toward the contact with practiced efficiency. What they discovered, too late, was that those 50 Albanians weren't retreating. They were bait, drawing Ottoman forces toward carefully prepared killing grounds where crossbow bolts waited in ambush. The patrol's death screams echoed across the valley for 17 seconds before abrupt silence announced that Skanderbeg's trap had claimed its first victims. Here's what happened next that defied every principle of medieval warfare. Instead of following up their ambush with withdrawal, Albanian forces attacked simultaneously from 3 directions, emerging from concealment like avenging demons materialized from mountain stone. 8,000 warriors who had spent hours crawling through terrain that would challenge mountain goats suddenly appeared on Ottoman flanks, rear, and center with coordination that suggested supernatural communication. Hamza's forces, awakened by battle cries echoing off valley walls, discovered themselves under attack by an enemy that shouldn't exist, from positions that shouldn't be possible, with intensity that transformed organized military formations into chaos within minutes. The psychological impact shattered Ottoman confidence before the first sword stroke landed. Warriors who had conquered Constantinople found themselves fighting for their lives against enemies emerging from solid rock. Janissaries, trained to maintain formation under any circumstances, broke ranks as Albanian fighters materialized among their supply trains, cutting down sentries and setting fire to equipment with systematic efficiency. The valley that had seemed like perfect defensive terrain moments earlier revealed itself as a carefully designed killing ground, with every apparent advantage transformed into fatal vulnerability. Within 37 minutes of first contact, the impossible was becoming reality. Ottoman formations, designed for open-field warfare against conventional enemies, collapsed under attacks that came from every direction simultaneously. Heavy cavalry, the Empire's decisive battlefield weapon, found themselves fighting dismounted on broken ground, where their horses became liabilities rather than advantages. Hamza's tactical reserves, positioned according to military doctrine, discovered that doctrinal positioning meant nothing when the enemy controlled high ground, escape routes, and initiative. The mathematics of annihilation revealed themselves with brutal clarity. 5,000 Ottomans died in the first hour, not from heroic single combat or glorious cavalry charges, but from systematic slaughter executed with mechanical precision. Albanian crossbowmen, positioned on slopes that provided perfect fields of fire, picked off fleeing soldiers like hunters culling deer. The valley's narrow exits, which should have facilitated organized withdrawal, became choke points where desperate men trampled each other in their panic to escape the killing ground that Albulina had become. By 8:30 a.m., Hamza Castrioti faced the impossible truth that his uncle had achieved tactical perfection through geographic genius and suicidal courage. 40,000 warriors were being destroyed by 8,000, and mathematical impossibility had become bloody reality. The silence that descended over Albulina Valley at 11:30 a.m. carried the weight of 25,000 corpses. Where 40,000 Ottoman warriors had awakened to confident victory just 5 hours earlier, a charnel house stretched across 3 miles of blood-soaked grassland. Bodies lay in such density that Albanian horses picked their way carefully through human wreckage, their riders staring in disbelief at carnage that defied mathematical possibility. The sweet stench of death mixed with smoke from burning Ottoman supply trains created an atmosphere so thick that veterans of a dozen battlefields covered their faces and fought nausea. Here's what the numbers revealed about medieval warfare's most impossible victory. 25,000 Ottoman dead carpeted the valley floor, including 1,200 Janissaries who had sworn to die before retreating. Another 8,000 prisoners, many wounded, sat under Albanian guard in the same formations where they had been trapped when Skanderbeg's ambush closed around them like steel jaws. Against these devastating losses, Albanian casualties numbered fewer than 600 dead and perhaps 1,500 wounded. The mathematical impossibility staggered even those who had witnessed it firsthand. 8,000 mountain fighters had achieved a casualty ratio that military historians would spend centuries trying to explain. Hamza Castrioti's body was discovered beneath a pile of his personal guards, his face turned toward the mountains where his uncle had learned the tactical genius that destroyed him. The sight of the young commander's corpse, still gripping a sword stained with Albanian blood, finally broke Skanderbeg's iron composure. Witnesses recorded that the Albanian leader wept openly over his nephew's remains, mourning not just family loss, but the tragedy of civil war that turned kinsmen into enemies. Victory tasted like ashes when purchased with the blood of loved ones, and the man who had achieved tactical perfection found himself haunted by its human cost. The material gains defied comprehension. Ottoman supply trains had carried enough gold to pay 40,000 men for 6 months, enough weapons to equip 10 armies, enough food to sustain a campaign lasting through winter. In 5 hours, the bankrupt Albanian resistance had captured treasure that would fund their rebellion for decades. Thousands of horses, including Arabian breeds worth small fortunes, fell into Albanian hands along with cannons, crossbows, and armor of quality that Albanian smiths could never match. Most valuable of all, they had captured detailed Ottoman maps showing planned invasion routes, fortress weaknesses, and strategic objectives that revealed the empire's long-term plans for European conquest. But the psychological impact transcended material calculations. News of Albulina raced across Europe faster than mounted messengers could carry it, transforming Ottoman reputation from invincible to vulnerable overnight. European courts that had been preparing to negotiate tributary status suddenly found courage to resist. Hungarian nobles, who had been quietly planning accommodation with Turkish expansion, began forming new alliances. Venetian merchants, reading intelligence reports that seemed too incredible to believe, started investing in Christian military ventures they had written off as hopeless causes. The strategic earthquake reached Istanbul within 10 days, where Sultan Mehmed II's fury reportedly shattered palace windows and terrified courtiers into silence. The same ruler who had conquered Constantinople, the military genius who had extended Ottoman power deeper into Europe than any predecessor, now faced the humiliating reality that Albanian mountain fighters had destroyed his largest army. Military advisors who had guaranteed Albanian submission found themselves explaining the inexplicable, while European ambassadors who had been begging for Ottoman mercy suddenly demanded audiences to discuss terms. Skanderbeg's impossible victory had achieved something beyond tactical brilliance. It had proven that Ottoman expansion could be stopped, that European resistance was not futile, that impossible odds were just another word for opportunity waiting to be seized. The reverberations of Albulina spread across 2 continents, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each wave carrying news that reshaped the medieval world's understanding of what was possible. Within 6 months of that July bloodbath, Hungarian forces had adopted Albanian mountain warfare tactics to devastating effect against Ottoman raiders. Wallachian princes, who had been preparing tributary agreements, suddenly found courage to resist. Polish cavalry commanders studied captured Albanian tactical manuals with the intensity of scholars deciphering sacred texts. The impossible had become instructional, and European military academies began teaching Skanderbeg's principles as standard doctrine. The Ottoman Empire's response revealed the true magnitude of their psychological wound. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, spent 3 years rebuilding the military reputation that 5 hours in an Albanian valley had shattered. No longer could Ottoman commanders expect enemies to flee at the sight of their banners. No longer could they assume that numerical superiority guaranteed victory. Albulina had planted a seed of doubt in minds that had never known uncertainty, and that doubt would prove more damaging than the 25,000 corpses Skanderbeg left scattered across his homeland. European chroniclers struggled to record events that challenged their understanding of divine providence. How could God allow infidels to conquer Christian Constantinople, then grant such overwhelming victory to a handful of Albanian Catholics? The theological implications sparked debates that lasted decades, while military historians found themselves confronting tactical innovations that textbooks had never addressed. Skanderbeg's use of terrain, timing, and psychological warfare created new categories of strategic thought that influenced battlefield doctrine for centuries. But the personal cost haunted Albania's victory celebrations. Skanderbeg never fully recovered from his nephew's death, and witnesses reported that he spoke Hamza's name in his sleep for years afterward. The man who had achieved military perfection discovered that perfection carried prices that gold could never pay. Every subsequent battle reminded him that warfare's greatest victories often demanded the sacrifice of what mattered most, transforming triumph into a burden that only other commanders could understand. The strategic consequences echoed through the remaining decades of the 15th century. Ottoman expansion into Central Europe slowed significantly as commanders struggled with enemy tactics that Albulina had validated. Albanian resistance, funded by captured Ottoman treasure, continued for another decade beyond what anyone had thought possible. European coalitions that had seemed hopeless suddenly appeared viable, and the balance of power that had favored Islam since Constantinople's fall began shifting back toward Christianity. Modern military academies still analyze Skanderbeg's tactical brilliance at Albulina, teaching principles of asymmetric warfare that remain relevant 5 centuries later. The battle stands as history's ultimate demonstration that numbers mean nothing when leadership, terrain, and timing combine with desperate courage. Every successful ambush, every underdog victory, every triumph of tactical genius over brute force carries echoes of that July morning when Albanian mountains witnessed the impossible become reality. That summer day in 1457, 8,000 Albanian warriors proved that mathematical impossibility was just another enemy to be defeated through superior preparation, perfect timing, and absolute commitment to victory. The mountains of Albania had crushed an empire's pride, transforming impossible odds into Europe's salvation and forever changing how the world understood the relationship between numbers and courage, between fate and human will, between what seems inevitable and what determined souls can actually achieve.